and begin the session. So my name is Sandra Murray. I'm a program coordinator for the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I'd like to welcome you from Queen's University, where I am today. And it's situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. I recognize that I am here as an uninvited guest on these beautiful unceded lands. And I just wanted to share, I'm kind of an outdoors person. I try to be environmentally conscientious. And when I'm out and about, sometimes I will bring garbage bags with me and I'll kind of pick up garbage that people before me have left because it's hurting our lands. And even though I didn't leave that garbage there, I take responsibility for the lands on which I live because it impacts everybody. And as I was thinking about this, I thought about the damage that has been done to not just these lands, but on the people the Indigenous people who were its caretakers long before we came along. Even though I didn't personally cause that harm, the tremendous harm that has been inflicted upon these peoples, and it has caused deep and lasting damage over the years. I think I need to take responsibility for reconciliation and healing of those peoples too. So not just the lands, but its peoples who have so much to offer us. So on that note, I wanted to, I'll hand it over to Lindsay, and thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks for starting us off with that beautiful land acknowledgement. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Greetings. My name is Lindsay Brant. So Lindsay Yunketsteno Brant de Voxenazre, Ganteke, Nide Wageno, Waganyato. So what I've said is that my name is Lindsay Brant. I'm from Ganteke, which is the place name for Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. It literally translates to on the bay because we are situated along the Bay of Quinte. I've also let you know that I sit with the Turtle Clan in Tyendinaga. Today I'm actually on campus in Kingston, so recognizing the shared lands that I'm on today as well. Today I have a presentation around decolonizing STEM. The first portion will be an overview of starting out with talking about decolonization and indigenization in general, and then moving into looking at the different ways of knowing, Western ways versus Indigenous ways, and what those differences and similarities are, and the ways that we can kind of look with a two-eyed seeing approach to those things. And then moving into some specific examples of what we can do as individuals, as people who care about teaching and learning to decolonize or indigenize STEM subjects. And so it'll be a very broad presentation. And then once I'm done kind of the speaking portion, will engage in a Q&A, and we'll stop the recording at that point so that you can feel free to ask any questions. That's a good chance to share with each other and use the expertise in the room and the experience in the room to ask and answer questions around perhaps your specific discipline, any questions that you've been wondering about, and we can all share a space in that way. So with that, I'll share my screen and we can get started. Oh, Sandra, can you enable screen sharing? I forgot to ask you to do that in the beginning. Thanks. Okay, so I introduced who I am personally, and I guess I should also introduce who I am professionally. So I'm an educational developer in Indigenous pedagogies and ways of knowing in the Center for Teaching and Learning. I also teach as an adjunct lecturer in the Smith School of Business, a course that I co-developed and co-teach with Kate Robotham, and that course is called Relationships and Reconciliation in Business and Beyond. I also am a PhD student in the Cultural Studies program. So those are kind of all my professional identities as well. So I mentioned my English name, my Mohawk name that was gifted to me by an elder in my community is Gawanahawi, which means she carries the words. That name is significant to me because I am a storyteller, I am a writer, and words are something that I hold quite dear. So that name definitely has informed a lot of my life, and has it constantly reminds me of my responsibilities and my gifts too. So with that, we'll get started. So I wanted to spend some time talking about what is decolonization, because I think we often that term has become used so often that it requires some unpacking, I think. So defining decolonization is an arduous task because there's so many contexts, understandings, and viewpoints about what it can or should mean, and or what it doesn't mean. And so understanding what decolonization means really comes down to how we understand colonization and our place within that, and how we're implicated in that process. If we try to understand, or at least have a sense of what colonization is, then I think we can begin to view decolonization as the undoing or unlearning of the colonial mindset. We can then create space for Indigenous ways of knowing, including social, political, spiritual, cultural contexts and worldviews to emerge. So there's often this like question of, as an Indigenous person, do I need to decolonize? And there's different viewpoints on that even, but I feel like I do, because I also went through a schooling system. I walk in two worlds, and I live in society outside of my community. And that colonial mindset is very much a part of the way that I've been trained to think as well. So I constantly have to call into question that. And I'm not immune to privileges that I know that I have. And so thinking about those things is also important for me personally too. So decolonization really requires us to ask ourselves a few questions. Some of them that I continually like to ask are, who am I? Where do I come from? And how and why am I connected to this place? I think if we think about those things and constantly ask those things, those questions, then we can come at this work from a very meaningful place, and a place that recognizes our sense of identity, our sense of worldview, and our sense of how am I connected to this place? How am I relating to this place? And how am I relating to other humans and not other than humans within this space? So what does it mean to be a good relative? What does it mean to be in relation with the things around me, or the people around me, or the aspects of creation around me? So for a more in-depth analysis, if you're wanting to kind of look at different sides of the definition, different meanings, and different scholars and what they've said about it, you can look at our website on the CTL webpage. It has a little bit more about what is decolonization, what is indigenization. And then I always recommend the Decolonization is Not a Metaphor article by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. I think that's a good place to kind of situate yourself and ground yourself in some concepts around the term and what it might can and should mean. So then we ask the question, what is indigenization? I think this is another one, that a term that gets used a lot. It's not one that I'm super a fan of, because it kind of denotes that we need to like add in Indigenous ways of knowing, rather than it being an organic and natural foundation to everything that we do, as it should be, I feel. So I struggle with that term, but I also do not know of a better term at this point, other than returning to original ways and returning to a resurgence and a rebuilding of Indigenous ways of knowing, and a balancing out of those ways of knowing with Western ones. So I guess that is what indigenization means in my mind, in that English term. But it's challenging to define that and think about what that looks like. But if we think about decolonization as the unsettling or undoing of the colonial power and structures and ways of learning and teaching, then indigenization can be understood as the redoing or reaffirming of education to include Indigenous ways of knowing, thinking, feeling, believing, and being. And so this work really involves elevating the voices of Indigenous peoples, meaningful inclusion of traditional and cultural knowledge, and intentional inclusion of Indigenous ways of teaching and learning to form and create pedagogical approaches. So this work can be done by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. For non-Indigenous people to take on this work, though, it does require respectful relationship building, ongoing consultation and partnership with Indigenous peoples, and it requires a willingness to continually engage in unlearning and unpacking of biases, examining power and privilege, and constantly learning from and with Indigenous peoples about their ways of knowing and their lived experiences. It means walking alongside rather than in front of, or exerting like your own thought into things that are ceremonial is also not a good way to go about it. But there are certain things that you can learn from Indigenous peoples that you can then incorporate or implement into your own teaching and your own learning practices in your own style and in your own way, by naming those things and citing those things as you would any other resource, or and to recognize that that relationship that you've built with those that are sharing knowledge with you is a continual relationship, and that requires you to constantly feed and nurture it as well. So there are various types of indigenization. So I always turn to this article from Gaudry and Lorenz in 2018, because it really highlights the different uses of the term indigenization across post-secondary institutes, in particular in Canada. And so there's three kind of layers or levels that they speak about in this article. And it really talks about the first one being Indigenous inclusion. So having a policy that aims to increase the number of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff in the Canadian Academy. And it does so largely by supporting the adoption or adaptation of Indigenous people into the current, often alienating culture of the Canadian Academy. So I think that this stage or this effort is definitely needed, and we need to do that in an ongoing way to make sure that we have Indigenous voices and peoples in our campus communities, in our, not only just in our student bodies, but also at all levels of staff, faculty, admin, making sure that there's lots of opportunity for engagement with Indigenous peoples in our spaces and places. And then the second one is reconciliation and indigenization. So this is really a vision that locates indigenization on common ground between Indigenous and Canadian ideals, creating a new, broader consensus on debates such as what counts as knowledge, how should Indigenous knowledge and European knowledge be reconciled, and what types of relationships academic institutions should have with Indigenous communities. So of course, this requires constant connection and relationship building with community, because who better to answer that question of what academic institutions should be doing to build relationship with community than communities themselves. I think often it's easy for us as institutions to say that we're doing a great job of building relationship with community by X number of partnerships, as X number of engagements, but if the Indigenous communities around us aren't saying that engagement and relationship building is where it's at, then that's the metric I think we should be caring about. And so I encourage us to think about that as well when we're thinking about relationships, is that it's reciprocal, it's two-sided, and there are multiple stories to be told on how we're doing in those spaces and places, and how we're doing with our relationship building and our connection. And then there's the third one, which is decolonial indigenization. So this one really envisions the wholesale overhaul of the academy to fundamentally reorient knowledge production based on balancing power relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, and transforming the academy into something dynamic and new. So there are various camps on this one as well. Like, is that possible? Can we decolonize a Western institution like Queen's? Is that a possibility? There are some people that say, no, that's not possible. We need to focus on building up Indigenous institutions, and that's really truly how we can achieve this kind of balancing or rebuild of education. And then there are others who say, like, yes, we can, let's burn it down and rebuild anew. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle ground. I think decolonizing academy is definitely a worthwhile pursuit. If I didn't feel that way, I probably wouldn't last very long in my position. I think there's a lot of hope to be found, a lot of really great potential to be found in the decolonizing agenda and what that looks like. And I think for different people, the level of engagement or their experience with that is varied. But to me, I'm still I remain hopeful that this is a space and a place that's open to transformation, and that we can encourage that by building capacity, building strength, and building partnerships between Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, and the institution. So it's a worthwhile endeavor. There's no real end point, but it's a journey that we can all take together. So I wanted to do a bit of a comparison between Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. And the source for this is the Alaska Native Science Commission. They have this lovely chart that they've created that really highlights some of the differences between the ways of knowing and the way that knowledge systems are structured. So on the left, my left, you have the Indigenous knowledge column, and then the scientific is on the other side. And so Indigenous knowledges are often assumed to be the truth. There's a lot of emphasis on storytelling. There's a lot of emphasis on saying this is the way things are and setting that into the minds of those taking up the knowledge. The sacred and the secular are blended together. So there's an opportunity to think of teaching and learning as both sacred and secular. So really thinking about it as a spiritual experience as well as an intellectual pursuit. And there's no like separation of church and state as we often see in Canadian politics or even Canadian in educational spaces too, is that there has been sometimes a point when we say like the sacred doesn't belong in this space, or if it does, it's only one certain sacred religion or aspect that gets implemented. And so there's a real blending of that in Indigenous knowledge systems where you're allowed to bring that spiritual element into the learning space, and it's encouraged and fostered. Teaching through storytelling is really important too. There's a lot of emphasis on imparting knowledge through the use of narrative, and also using that as a guiding structure or a guiding tool for educating or imparting knowledge. And it's not that those stories are the absolutes. In fact, there's also like this sense of non-interference. So if an elder shares a teaching, they're meant to say tell you and give you perspective, but it's not to put down a certain judgment and say, this is how you must do things. It's up to you as the receiver of that story to determine how it impacts your life. Where you're at in your life will also kind of reflect how you engage with that story and what you do with it. And so that's meant to like impart knowledge, but not tell you that this is the way you need to do things. It's to teach you to take that responsibility for yourself and determine that for yourself. Learning by doing and experiencing is huge. There's a lot of emphasis on giving a lot of chances to try things out, make mistakes, engage by watching, listening, learning, and then doing. So that's a community-based learning approach. Sharing circles are often done in that way too, where you can like have a chance to test out ideas that you might have. You can have a chance to work alongside others, almost in like an apprenticeship mentorship model. And the best learning comes through watching and listening, and then trying it for yourself, and then kind of getting feedback based on those observing you when you're doing the learning, and then having a time to reflect on that too. So a lot of Indigenous knowledge is very oral or visual based as well. So there's a lot of use of oral narrative. There's a lot of use of visual depictions, either through like drawings or engagement in kind of arts and things like that, but also visual in the sense that our languages are highly visual. Our cultures are highly visual in that we use a lot of metaphor. We use a lot of description in our languages and in the way that we describe things. And so the words, the languages really paint a picture in your mind as you're taking up new concepts or learning new things. And so it's really difficult to engage in Indigenous knowledges and worldview without having that foundational understanding of language as well. And it's so important to how we think about things and how we develop our worldviews. The Indigenous knowledge systems are often integrated based on a whole system. So really thinking about things holistically, and then thinking about the parts and pieces, but also how they kind of form together to create that whole, and what does that look like, and balancing that out in some kind of way, or figuring that out for ourselves. That they're also very intuitive approaches, holistic in terms of engaging the whole learner or the whole experience of emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental, and what that might mean. It's very subjective, so there's no like definitive truths that like you can prove without a doubt, but there's like a lot of nuance that comes into teachings and things that come into things. And then there's also experiential. So really, like I said, focusing on learning by doing, trial and error and willingness to make mistakes and learn through that as well. So the part that is, to me, when I look at this side of the framework, is that in one instance, at the beginning, it says assumed to be the truth, and then it says subjective. Well, how can those two things exist? And so I think what it means by assumed to be the truth is that a lot of people think that our stories are like legends. They're not. They're actually live events that happened, or they're events that are based on an actual event that did happen. And so sometimes the more you tell it, the further it gets removed from that like truth or that moment in time when it actually happened. But it is still assumed and known in our cultures to be an actual event that was the truth at the time. And so that's what's meant by assumed to be the truth. And then subjective is like every time it gets told, it's told in a different way and you receive it in a different way. And so seemingly two different things are actually can be explained in that way. So the scientific knowledge piece, I think we know a lot about how this gets structured. So we assume it to be the best approximation or the closest in proximity that we can think of through scientific or mathematical thought or calculations. Secular only, so often the spiritual gets left out or subtracted out of the equation when it comes to engaging in teaching and learning. It's very didactic. Learning by formal education is often prioritized or thought to be more superior, I think, in a lot of ways. It's based on a lot of written text or written communication styles. It's analytical, based on subsets of the whole, so really breaking things apart and separating into disciplines or fields of study or things like that. It's model or hypothesis based, reductionist, objective, and positivist. So there's some differences, but there's ways that we can kind of look at these both of these approaches and take the best of both approaches to make a really dynamic and new way of looking at teaching and learning. So a little bit more about Indigenous worldviews. There's a lot of emphasis on that I try to really drive this point home to a lot of people, is that a universal Indigenous worldview doesn't exist. There's so many nuances and differences between different nations, communities. Even within one community, there can be differences in what worldview is, or what cultural teachings are meaningful to a certain person can vary from individual to individual. So it's very hard to stay in it's important to stay away from kind of that pan-Indigenous way of thinking about worldview, because it is so different across, as I said, even in one community, not even considering differences between communities and nations and groups. So it's important to think about that always. Indigenous cultural worldviews are diverse, but the core is deeply connected to land and water. I think that's something that we can say is spreads across many different Indigenous groups, and not just ones within North America, but throughout the world, I think. Indigenous cultures are very much connected to place. So they're place-based and land-based, and that means that the knowledge really does come from the lands. And so it's difficult to disconnect learning from land and learning from place. And there's a danger in doing that, because a lot gets lost. Indigenous cultures are not static, nor have they vanished through assimilation. So it's sometimes, I think we need to get away from that thinking of Indigenous cultures as being something of the past or being in the past. We've moved our ways of knowing and being consistently with us throughout time. And obviously colonization and settlement and all of those awful, terrible things that have happened have tried to strip that away, but we're working constantly on revitalizing and bringing those things forward and making sure that they survive. And so it's important to recognize that resilience and recognize that effort that's being put into preserving and carrying forward strongly and bravely our traditions, our cultures, and our languages. Many Indigenous peoples have adapted to colonial realities while still holding their own cultural worldviews, so walking in both worlds. As I mentioned, I live in Tyndonega, but I obviously work here at Queen's, and so I have to navigate and walk in constantly multiple worlds. And for me, that's even I think further complicated by the fact, or implicated in the fact, that I have multiple identities as well. So I primarily, I always like to say, primarily, I think of myself as Mohawk, but I'm also mixed. So on my mom's side, I'm Scottish, British, and Algonquin. And so that's a mixed identity. And I recognize that I have all different pieces and parts of me that I carry with me at all times. And I need to be aware of my privilege as well that I carry, because I am lighter skinned, I'm white passing, and that is very much a privilege that I have that other Indigenous peoples do not have. And so I'm aware of that. I try to unpack that, try to interrogate that, and think about and question myself when I'm saying something. Am I considering that I can say things sometimes more freely than my other Indigenous colleagues or friends? And I don't take that for granted. And I try to make sure that I'm recognizing that for myself. So I think what Indigenous worldviews often ask, and what I ask myself as well, is how am I fulfilling my responsibilities in this relationship, and how am I being a good relative? And that's something that we all can ask ourselves and think about. What is my relationship to decolonization? What is my relationship to indigenization? What is my relationship to another human, or another other than human, or to these lands? How am I fulfilling that? And what does that look like? And how am I being a good relative? That's a good way, a check and balance that we can all kind of do and provide for ourselves, and to constantly work at reflecting on that. So there are also some core Indigenous values that I'd like to highlight too, because I think there's a lot of emphasis on holism. Elements of the whole are interconnected such that they cannot be understood separately, nor without reference to the whole. So thinking about, as I said, emotional, spiritual, mental, and physical ways of being, thinking about that for ourselves in relation to others, but also thinking about that in terms of what does that mean for teaching and learning? What does it mean for me to engage in those ways with my students? Another thing is relationality, so deep connection and responsibility to family, community, environment, and creation, both human and non-human relations. Balance and harmony, so within and between all dimensions of self, wellness, relationships, environment, etc. And then respect and gratitude for humans and non-humans, really thinking about our sense of gratitude for all that we've been given, our connection to all elements of creation. To walk in the world in a way of gratitude is really important for many Indigenous groups, and particularly for me as a Haudenosaunee woman, is to always make sure that I'm coming from a place of connection and caring for my environment around me, for creation, for others within spaces and places. So being responsible for the energy that I bring to those spaces and into those relationships as well. So now getting to the STEM part. Why decolonize STEM? I think it's not about abolishing the canon, but we must interrogate and its assumptions and broaden our intellectual vision to include a wider range of perspectives. It's about centering and uplifting Indigenous voices and experiences, challenging the oppression of Indigenous peoples, advocating for Indigenous rights, sovereignty, land, and nation building. And it's to recognize that knowledge is inevitably marked by power relations, and most disciplines give disproportionate prominence to the experiences, concerns, and achievements of the dominant group. So to work towards undoing that, we can promote and support Indigenous ways of knowing, challenge the deficit thinking of Indigenous ways of knowing as being less than, and really center meaningful relationship building and connection between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, combat stereotypes, and promote intercultural understanding through education. We can encourage, we need to have spaces where students see themselves reflected in the curriculum as legitimate creators and carriers of knowledge. So for Indigenous students at Queen's, and any student really, they need to see themselves reflected in the content that they're learning. They need to see professors that look like them, that think like them, that feel like they feel, to feel valued and supported in spaces, because the academy can be very isolating and a harmful place for students. So let's be honest and say that it's not designed to support every single student unless we work to make sure that it's a space where every single student can feel like it was made for them. And that's a kind of a hard realization and a huge undertaking, but it's not something that's impossible. It's actually, when we have the tools, we equip ourselves with the knowledge, we can do that for our students, we can do that for each other. So modern day environmental problems also have social and cultural dimensions which benefit from perspectives other than Western science. So we can think about and begin to solve real world problems such as climate change, water crisis. All of those solutions are often found quite easily in Indigenous ways of knowing, but we just haven't taken the time to sit down with Indigenous peoples, sit down with Indigenous communities, and learn from them about what they think might be best to support themselves and the rest of the planet and the rest of the earth. So it's a good idea to bring in those perspectives so that we can learn and engage and facilitate new ways of thinking about solving these problems. So the question I often get asked and try to help guide faculty and other educators and stakeholders at Queen's in or through is, what can I do? And so because it seems so insurmountable, it seems like there's no end point, and there really isn't like a perceived like check, yeah, we've done it, we've decolonized. It can be easy, become easy to be lost or to feel helpless or hopeless in this pursuit, but there are ways that we can start and just begin walking down this journey and down this pathway together. And so ask yourself, I think, firstly, why do you want to decolonize? Who are you doing it for, and why are you doing it? And thinking about that is a good way to frame the conversation with yourself and the ongoing connection and tie to why you're doing the work. Self-educate, so be prepared to learn and unlearn. Critically reflect on your knowledge production, research, teaching, and communities of practice. Uplift and amplify theory, scholarship, and activism of decolonizing and anti-racist Black, Indigenous, and people of color, including students. So really thinking about how to bring in various perspectives into your curriculum, but also into the way that you include people within your spaces and places as well. Discuss and learn with others and form a community of practice. Be specific about your aims for change and their limitations. Decenter yourself and be cognizant of your positionality and unpack your privilege. And then also avoid performative allyship and extractive approaches to gaining knowledge. So really thinking about how can you engage with Indigenous peoples and communities without further burdening them with additional emotional labor or intellectual labor that you could perhaps take on yourself alongside them in consultation, or are there things that you can carry out to kind of be alongside of them, but also are there things that you can move forward independently as well to like create space so that decolonization can happen. Be prepared to be uncomfortable and normalize that feeling for yourself of feeling unsettled, because whenever we're departing from our own worldview, our own kind of level or realm of understanding and of possibilities, it's uncomfortable. I'm constantly uncomfortable in the work that I do. And if I wasn't, I would be questioning whether or not I'm doing a great job, because I think to do this type of work, you have to constantly be questioning, you have to constantly be interrogate your own comfort level, and to move beyond that is to move through it. And so, and I don't know if we'll ever get to a place where this work is comfortable. And I think that's a good thing. That's a really, really good thing. And so it's the part that's challenging is to be okay with it, to be okay with that discomfort, to be okay with the fact that it's never going to feel like you have all the answers, because you're not meant to. So what does it look like and feel like? I think to talk about that a little bit more is important as well. So how can non-Indigenous people contribute? It looks a lot like and feels a lot like deep listening, self-reflexivity, creating space, being in action. So really taking actions and figuring out for yourself, what are some things that I can do within my space, in my place in the academy or in my workplace or in my home? What are some small steps that might lead to ripple effect and create change beyond myself and my immediate context? And then to build relationships with Indigenous peoples, to sit down with colleagues, friends, community members, to create connections, to engage in spaces where you might meet people that you could develop connections with, and to commit to learning and unlearning constantly. And advocating for change within educational spaces, structures, policies, and classrooms. We all have different roles and different kind of agency, but to recognize that agency and to push back when you think that you should have more agency, or that you might have a voice to lend to creating some change, is to be brave enough to kind of step forward and put yourself out there to try to create that change is important as well. What is being done? So I wanted to highlight as well, like some examples of decolonizing STEM, because I think it's important to see what others are doing, to know like what kind of work is out there and what is possible. So I've included some links here, and I'll send out these slides to everyone that's in this space today that registered, and I will send out the slides to you all so that you can investigate these on your own. But there's a few around. Decolonizing.com is a great resource because it talks about an interdisciplinary team of scholars working together to look at physics and the reproduction of colonialism within and through physics in higher education. And it explores the ways of academic decolonization and what that might look like specifically for physics. And then there's also this really interesting resource on the library website around Indigenous initiatives in engineering education in Canada, and some of the collective contributions from many institutions across Canada. And so it gives a good kind of insight into what's going on in other places beyond Queens. And then there's a narrative inquiry into my experiences co-teaching alongside Cree educators, Indigenization and school mathematics. I like this because it's really a narrative approach, and it's a journey. It's one educator talking about their experience with like working with an Indigenous community to explore what it would mean to decolonize and indigenize mathematics. And so it's a good entry point into that if you haven't considered looking at what that might look like for you, or you're wondering about what it has looked like for others. And then decolonizing computing with a question mark, is that possible? And so this article kind of sets out to answer that question. So those are some resources that I found that I personally liked learning from and working through as well. And then these are the references from today. So the ones that I highlighted, the Gaudry and Lorenz article, the resources we have on the Queen's Center for Teaching and Learning website. There's also a Conversations on Decolonization module that's available at Queen's. This link here should get you to the version that you don't have to have your net ID entered in to do, in case you just want to look at it and not worry about if it's going to count on your record. And then there's also Combining Two Ways of Knowing, which is a great website that I found that compares the two, like Western versus Indigenous, and talks about the differences and the nuances in each and between the two as well. And then more resources, I've compiled like different ones based on subjects. So Decolonizing Science, there's a reading list, there's a technology reading list, there's different websites talking about Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, Western science and traditional knowledges. That one talks a lot about forms of knowledge and what they can kind of, how they can speak to each other, how we can learn from them. And then there's Centering the Indigenous in Science Education, Possibilities and Limitations of Decolonizing the Academy. And then Naturalizing Indigenous Knowledge. I also like that resource as well. And then I've cited at the bottom some experts to look to. So Dr. Leroy Littlebear talks a lot about physics, and then in metaphysics as well. And then Dr. Kim Tallbear talks a lot about connection to those types of things as well. And then Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, is another recommendation. There are many other resources I picked up since this, since even the creation of this webinar. So I'm hoping to continually compile a list and provide to those that are seeking maybe a bit more guidance around where to find these resources. But the trick, I think, to researching and finding things in this area is really trying to find specific communities, specific names of scholars doing the work, because you can cast kind of a wide net and get a lot of general resources, but to follow examples of case studies of how it's being done is to like narrow it down to community-based knowledge or like place-based knowledge. And to know where to find that, you have to kind of look to the local communities and what they call themselves or what they call their knowledge, to know even what search terms to use. So that can be challenging as well. But you each have library resources, a librarian that's specific to your subject. I would encourage you to reach out to the library staff, because they are skilled at navigating those databases, and they can help you find the words that you need to type into the search engines to get the results that you're looking for. So I think that's it for the formal speaking part of the presentation. And I will open it up now to Q&A.